The winter wind cut through the city streets like a blade, carrying with it the smell of roasted chestnuts and the distant sound of holiday music from expensive restaurants. Marcus stood outside a busy cafe on Fifth Avenue, his thin jacket doing little to protect him from the cold. His violin case lay open at his feet, empty except for a few coins that barely added up to $2. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, surviving only on stale bread from a bakery that threw out day-old goods behind their shop. Marcus was 23 years old, but the streets had aged him beyond his years. His face was gaunt, his clothes worn and patched in places, yet his hands remained steady, fingers long and elegant, the hands of an artist. Those hands now clutched his violin, the only possession he had left from his former life. The instrument was old but beautiful, its wood rich with the patina of age and constant use. He had been standing outside the cafe for an hour, watching well-dressed people come and go with their shopping bags and takeout containers. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries wafted through the door each time it opened, making his stomach clench with hunger. Marcus had played several pieces already, pouring his heart into each note, but people hurried past without stopping. Some glanced at him with pity, others with disgust, and most simply ignored him entirely. A businessman in an expensive coat dropped a quarter into his case without breaking stride or making eye contact. Marcus nodded his thanks to the man's retreating back, but inside he felt the familiar sting of invisibility. He was just part of the urban landscape to these people, no different from a fire hydrant or a street sign. As the lunch rush began, Marcus decided to try something different. He approached the outdoor seating area of the cafe where several people sat, bundled in blankets provided by the establishment, sipping hot drinks and eating sandwiches. His legs felt weak and he steadied himself against a lamppost for a moment before walking forward. The manager, a stocky man with a red face and suspicious eyes, spotted Marcus immediately. He had been watching the young man all morning, making sure he didn't bother the customers. Now, seeing Marcus approach the seating area, he moved quickly to intercept him. Marcus stopped a respectful distance from the tables and cleared his throat. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scratched from days of little water in the cold air. He addressed the manager but spoke loud enough for the nearby diners to hear. "Sir, I know I'm not supposed to ask for handouts. I'm not asking for charity." Marcus lifted his violin slightly, his grip gentle despite the trembling in his hands. "I'm a musician, a trained musician. If I could just play one piece, just one song for these people, maybe someone would be willing to share a bit of food. I haven't eaten in days. I can perform for a bite of food." The manager's face flushed deeper red. He glanced nervously at his customers, worried about the scene developing at his establishment. Several diners had stopped eating and were watching the exchange with varying expressions of discomfort and curiosity. "You need to move along," the manager said firmly, keeping his voice low but stern. "You can't solicit our customers. I'll call the police if you don't leave now." But before Marcus could respond, a woman at one of the tables laughed. It was a sharp, mocking sound that cut through the cold air. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, wearing designer clothes and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Her companion, a man in similar expensive attire, joined in the laughter. "Did he just say he's a trained musician?" the woman said loudly to her companion, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look at him. He probably can't even play that thing properly. These street people will say anything for money." Her companion smirked, looking Marcus up and down with obvious disdain. "Trained musician," he repeated mockingly. "Right, and I'm a trained astronaut. He probably found that violin in a dumpster." Other diners shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, embarrassed by the cruelty, but unwilling to intervene. The couple seemed energized by their own wit, feeding off each other's mockery. Marcus felt heat rise to his face despite the cold. He had experienced rejection and indifference countless times since falling into homelessness. But this open ridicule stung in a way he hadn't prepared himself for. His fingers tightened around the neck of his violin, and for a moment he considered just walking away, disappearing back into the anonymous flow of city pedestrians. The manager seized the opportunity, emboldened by the couple's reaction. "See, you're disturbing my customers. I'm going to have to ask you one more time to leave or I'm calling the cops." Marcus stood frozen, his pride warring with his desperation. The violin felt heavy in his hands, both a burden and a lifeline. He thought about the years of practice, the conservatory training, the scholarships and competitions he had won before everything fell apart. He thought about his teacher, Professor Chen, who had called him gifted, who had predicted a brilliant future for him. The mocking woman pulled out her phone, holding it up as if to record him. "This is actually hilarious. Wait until I show everyone." Homeless guy claims he's a concert violinist. The audacity. Something shifted in Marcus at that moment. The humiliation transformed into something else, something fiercer. He had lost his apartment, his connections, his place in society. But he had never lost his ability to play. That was something they couldn't take from him, no matter how much they laughed. Marcus lifted his chin and looked directly at the woman. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and calm. "One song? Give me one song. If you don't think I can play after you hear it, I'll leave immediately and never come back. But if I prove I can play, truly play, then someone shares their food with me. That's all I'm asking." The manager started to protest, but the woman held up her hand, still filming with her phone. This was too entertaining to stop now. "You know what? Sure, let's hear this trained musician play. This is going to be great content." She looked around at the other tables, several people now openly watching the scene unfold. "Everyone, we're about to witness a performance from a master violinist," she announced mockingly. "Make sure you capture this moment." Marcus stepped back slightly, giving himself space. His heart was pounding, not from nervousness about playing, but from the physical weakness that came from prolonged hunger. He closed his eyes briefly, shutting out the mocking faces, the phone cameras, the judgment. He thought about the music, only the music. When he opened his eyes again, everything had changed. The street noise faded. The cold seemed less biting. Marcus raised his violin to his shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who had done this motion 10,000 times. The instrument settled into place like it was part of his body, an extension of himself. He lifted his bow, and for just a moment before it touched the strings, complete silence fell over the cafe's outdoor seating area. Even the mockers had stopped laughing, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus took a breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs, and then he began to play. The first notes that came from Marcus's violin were soft, almost hesitant, like a question being asked. But within seconds, the music began to build, transforming from whisper to conversation to declaration. He had chosen Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons, a piece that seemed fitting for the cold December day, a piece he knew so well he could play it in his sleep. His fingers moved across the strings with impossible speed and precision, finding each note perfectly despite the cold that should have made his hand stiff and clumsy. The bow danced across the strings, drawing out sounds that seemed too pure and powerful to come from such a worn instrument held by such a broken-looking man. The change in the atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. The mocking woman's smile faded from her face, her phone still recording but now forgotten in her hand. Her companion's smirk disappeared, replaced by an expression of genuine shock. Around them, other diners set down their forks and cups, transfixed by what they were hearing. Marcus's eyes were closed now, his whole body moving with the music. Despite his thin frame and obvious weakness when he played, he transformed. His posture straightened, his movements became fluid and confident. The violin sang under his fingers, producing a sound that was rich and full, each note perfectly articulated, each phrase shaped with the touch of a master. The fast passages that made Winter famous came cascading from his instrument with breathtaking clarity. His bow arm moved with controlled fury, mimicking the violence of a winter storm, while his left hand flew up and down the fingerboard with precision that seemed superhuman. This wasn't just competent playing. This was virtuoso-level performance, the kind of skill that took years of dedicated training and natural talent to achieve. People walking by on the sidewalk began to stop. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the extraordinary music cutting through the urban noise. An elderly woman with grocery bags set them down to listen, her eyes filling with tears. A young man in delivery uniform paused his bicycle, standing with one foot on the ground, mesmerized. Even the manager, who had been so ready to call the police, stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. Marcus played on, oblivious to the gathering crowd, lost in the music. The piece moved from the violent opening passages to the beautiful, lyrical, slow movement. Here his playing became tender and intimate, each note a small jewel of sound. His bow barely seemed to touch the strings, yet the music filled the space around them with crystalline clarity. In the cafe, behind the windows, staff members had stopped working to watch and listen. The barista stood with a coffee pot in hand, frozen in the middle of a pour. The cook had come out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron drawn by the music. Customers inside were standing, pressing close to the windows to see the source of this extraordinary performance. The woman who had mocked him now had tears running down her cheeks, though she seemed unaware of them. Her phone was still recording, but her expression had completely changed from cruel amusement to something like shame mixed with awe. Her companion had removed his sunglasses, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine emotion. As Marcus played, something else happened. People began to remember why music mattered. In the rush and stress of city life, in the constant pursuit of money and status and success, they had forgotten what it felt like to be truly moved by art. This homeless man, this person they had dismissed as less than them, was reminding them of something essential and human that they had lost. The final movement of Winter erupted from Marcus's violin with renewed energy. His playing became almost violent in its intensity, perfectly capturing the fury of a winter storm. His whole body moved with the music, the bow striking the strings with controlled aggression, his fingers flying with impossible speed. Sweat had formed on his forehead despite the cold, running down his temples with the physical effort of the performance. The crowd around him had grown to perhaps 50 people now, blocking the sidewalk, some standing in the street. Cars had slowed down, drivers craning their necks to see what was causing the gathering. The entire block seemed to have stopped, held in thrall by the homeless violinist playing outside a cafe. Marcus drove toward the final notes with everything he had left. His body was weak from hunger, his muscles trembling from more than just the effort of playing. But he poured every ounce of remaining strength into those last measures. The music built to its thrilling conclusion, the final flourish of notes ascending and then resolving with perfect clarity. When he drew the final note from the strings and let it fade into silence, Marcus lowered his violin slowly. For a moment, no one moved. The silence that followed was as complete as if someone had turned off the sound in a movie. Marcus opened his eyes, breathing hard, suddenly aware again of the cold, the hunger, the dozens of people staring at him. Then the applause began. It started with the elderly woman who had set down her groceries, her clapping sharp and enthusiastic. Within seconds, everyone joined in. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, people whistling and shouting praise. It wasn't the polite applause of a concert hall, but something more raw and genuine, the kind of response that comes from being genuinely moved. The woman who had mocked him was crying openly now, her expensive makeup running down her face. She set down her phone with shaking hands and stood up from her table. Her companion followed, both of them looking shaken and humbled. Marcus swayed slightly, the adrenaline that had carried him through the performance now draining away, leaving him acutely aware of how weak he truly was. His hands were trembling as he lowered the violin completely, and he had to lock his knees to keep standing. The elderly woman pushed through the crowd and pressed a $20 bill into his hand. "That was beautiful, young man. Truly beautiful." Others followed, suddenly eager to contribute. Money began filling his violin case, bills and coins dropping in a steady stream. But the mocking woman reached him first. She stood in front of Marcus, tears still streaming down her face, her earlier arrogance completely gone. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I had no right to treat you that way. I judged you without knowing anything about you." Marcus looked at her, seeing genuine remorse in her eyes. He was too exhausted to feel anger or satisfaction at her change of heart. He just nodded slightly, acknowledging her apology. The manager of the cafe had disappeared inside during the applause. Now he emerged carrying a large bag. He approached Marcus with an expression that mixed embarrassment with respect. "Sir, I apologize for how I treated you. Please take this. Sandwiches, soup, coffee. It's on the house." Marcus reached for the bag and his hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it. The manager steadied it for him, genuine concern on his face. "When did you last eat?" 3 days ago, Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe 4. I'm not sure anymore." A murmur went through the crowd at this admission. The delivery man who had stopped his bicycle pulled out his wallet and emptied it into Marcus's violin case. A businessman in a suit did the same. People who had been planning to walk by without a second glance were now competing to help. Marcus sat down heavily on a bench near the cafe, his legs no longer able to support him. He opened the bag the manager had given him with trembling hands and pulled out a sandwich. Turkey and cheese on fresh bread. The smell of it made him dizzy with hunger. He bit into it, and the taste was so overwhelming that tears came to his eyes. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many people stopping to drop money into his case or offer words of encouragement and appreciation. The woman who had mocked him stood nearby, clearly wanting to do something more to make amends but not knowing what. Her companion had already pulled out his wallet and put several $100s in the violin case. Marcus ate slowly, forcing himself not to rush despite his desperate hunger. He knew that eating too quickly after days without food could make him sick. Between bites, he sipped the hot coffee the manager had brought, feeling the warmth spread through his body. Each swallow felt like a small miracle. A well-dressed older man approached, moving through the remaining onlookers with purpose. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind expensive glasses. Unlike the others who had rushed forward with money and apologies, he waited patiently until Marcus had finished most of his sandwich. "May I sit?" the man asked, gesturing to the bench. Marcus nodded, too tired and overwhelmed to speak. The man sat down, maintaining a respectful distance. "My name is Robert Chen," the man said, and Marcus's head snapped up at the name. "I see you recognize it." "Yes, I'm that Chen. I teach at Juilliard, have for 30 years now." Marcus stared at the professor, unable to believe what he was hearing. Robert Chen was a legend in the classical music world, a renowned violinist who had performed with every major orchestra before turning to teaching. He had trained some of the most successful musicians of the current generation. "I was walking by when I heard you playing," Chen continued, his voice calm and measured. "At first I thought it was a recording. The quality of the sound, the interpretation. It seemed impossible that someone was producing that music live on a street corner. But then I saw you." Marcus set down his sandwich, his appetite momentarily forgotten. He waited for Chen to continue, his heart pounding. "Your technique is extraordinary. The way you handle the rapid passages, your intonation, your vibrato, the emotional depth of your interpretation. These are not things that can be faked or stumbled upon. You've had serious, extensive training." Chen paused, studying Marcus's face. "Tell me, where did you study?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But something about Chen's manner, the genuine interest in his eyes, made him want to answer honestly. "San Francisco Conservatory of Music. I was there for 3 years. Full scholarship." Chen nodded slowly, as if this confirmed what he had suspected. "What happened? How did someone with your level of skill end up performing for food on a Manhattan street corner?" The question wasn't accusatory or judgmental, just curious, concerned. Marcus looked down at his hands, at the calluses on his fingers that remained despite everything else he had lost. "My mother got sick. Cancer." His voice was flat, emotionless, the way it got when he talked about painful things. "I was in my final year. The bills started piling up, even with insurance. I came home to help take care of her, thinking I could finish my degree later. I worked 3 jobs, played weddings and parties on weekends. It wasn't enough." Chen listened without interrupting, his expression sympathetic but not pitying. "She died in April, 2 years ago. By then I had dropped out officially. I had debt from trying to cover her medical expenses, debt from student loans that I had to start paying back since I wasn't enrolled anymore. I couldn't afford to go back to San Francisco. Couldn't afford the tuition even if I could get another scholarship. I tried to stay in my hometown. But without a degree, the teaching jobs weren't available. The wedding and party gigs dried up." Marcus picked up his coffee cup but didn't drink, just held it between his hands, feeling the warmth. "I came to New York thinking there would be more opportunities. Maybe I could get orchestra work, audition for shows, something. But without the right connections, without a degree to my name, no one would hear me play. I couldn't even get past the initial application stages. My savings ran out. Then my apartment. The shelters were full most nights." He gestured to himself, to his worn clothes and the violin case. "This is what was left. The violin was my grandfather's. It's the only thing I refused to sell even when I had nothing else." Chen was quiet for a long moment, processing the story. Then he spoke carefully. "You said you were in your final year when you left. How much did you have left to complete?" "1 semester. Just one." Marcus laughed bitterly. "I was supposed to do my senior recital in May. Instead, I was working the night shift at a convenience store and watching my mother die." "And you've been on the streets how long?" 6 months. Maybe 7 now. I've lost track of time. Chen reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. He held it out to Marcus, who took it with his free hand. The card was simple, elegant, with Chen's name and contact information at Juilliard. I want you to come see me on Monday. My office, 10 in the morning. I've written the address on the back. Chen stood up, preparing to leave. Don't be late. Marcus looked up at him, confusion and hope warring on his face. I don't understand. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Chen smiled slightly. I've been teaching for 3 decades. I've heard thousands of students play. I can count on one hand the number of times I've heard someone play the way you just did. That kind of talent is rare and it shouldn't be wasted living on the street. He paused, his expression serious. Talent alone isn't enough in this world. You need opportunity, connections, support. You had those once and lost them through no fault of your own. Maybe it's time you had them again. Before Marcus could respond, Chen had turned and walked away, disappearing into the flow of pedestrians on the sidewalk. Marcus stared at the business card in his hand, reading it over and over, afraid that if he looked away it might disappear like a dream. The woman who had mocked him earlier was still standing nearby, and she approached tentatively. She had composed herself, though her eyes were still red from crying. I recorded your performance, she said quietly. Would it be okay if I posted it online? I think people should hear you play. Marcus looked at her, seeing genuine remorse and something else in her expression, a desire to make amends in whatever way she could. He nodded slowly. Okay. She pulled out her phone and showed him the video. Even on the small screen with the phone's limited speakers, his playing sounded remarkable. The video had captured not just the music but the crowd's reaction, the transformation from mockery to awe. I'll make sure to explain what happened, she said. The truth. About how we treated you at first, how wrong we were, and how incredibly you played despite everything. She hesitated, then added, My name is Jennifer, by the way. I work in social media marketing. I have about 500,000 followers across platforms. If this goes viral, it could really help you. Marcus didn't know much about social media or viral videos, but he recognized that she was trying to help. Thank you, he said simply. Jennifer nodded and stepped back, already typing on her phone. Within minutes, she had posted the video to multiple platforms with a caption explaining what had happened, including her own shame at having mocked him. She tagged it with keywords that she knew would attract attention. By the time Marcus had finished eating and drinking everything the cafe manager had brought him, his violin case was overflowing with money. He counted it carefully, his hands still shaking slightly, nearly $800, more money than he had seen in 6 months. Enough for a cheap hotel room for a week, food, maybe some warmer clothes. The manager came out again, this time with a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s. This is my daughter, Sarah. She's studying violin at NYU. Sarah looked at Marcus with wide eyes full of admiration. That was incredible. I've been playing for 12 years and I can't play winter like that. Would you, do you give lessons? I would pay you. I'd really love to learn from you. Marcus was overwhelmed by the question. Just an hour ago, he had been begging to play for food, invisible to the world around him. Now a conservatory student was asking for lessons. I don't have anywhere to teach, he said honestly. The manager spoke up quickly. You could use the cafe after hours. We close at 8. You could teach here from 8 to 10, and I wouldn't charge you anything for using the space. Marcus looked between the manager and his daughter, seeing genuine offers being made, real opportunities opening up. I would be honored, he finally said to Sarah. We can work out a schedule. The video Jennifer posted began spreading across the internet with remarkable speed. By evening, it had been viewed 50,000 times. By midnight, the number had climbed to 500,000. The story resonated with people in a way that transcended the music itself. It was a story about judgment and redemption, about hidden worth and second chances, about the humanity we miss when we look past those we consider beneath us. Marcus spent that first night in a budget hotel room, the first real bed he had slept in for months, but sleep came slowly despite his exhaustion. He kept thinking about Robert Chen's business card, about the meeting scheduled for Monday morning. It was Friday night now, which meant he had the entire weekend to prepare himself, to clean up, to try to look presentable for whatever opportunity Chen might offer. On Saturday morning, Marcus used some of his money to buy new clothes from a thrift store. Nothing fancy but clean and professional. A pair of dark pants, a button-down shirt, a jacket that fit reasonably well. He got a haircut at a barber school where students practiced on volunteer clients. When he looked at himself in the mirror afterward, he saw glimpses of the person he used to be. The confident young musician who had dreamed of performing in concert halls. The video continued to spread throughout the weekend. News outlets picked up the story, running articles with headlines like "Homeless Violin Virtuoso Stuns Manhattan" and "Street Musician's Incredible Talent Revealed After Cruel Mockery." Jennifer had been true to her word, telling the complete story, including her own role in mocking Marcus initially. Her honesty about her mistake made the story even more compelling, and her followers responded with overwhelming support for Marcus. By Sunday evening, the video had been viewed over 5 million times. Marcus's violin case had become a symbol in the story, and people who saw the video began seeking him out. But Marcus wasn't on his usual corner. He was in his hotel room practicing, making sure his skills were as sharp as possible for his meeting with Chen. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. Marcus woke early, showered carefully, and dressed in his new clothes. He looked at himself in the mirror one more time, trying to see what Chen had seen when he listened to him play. Not the homeless man, but the musician, the artist. The Juilliard building was impressive, all modern architecture and glass. Marcus stood outside for several minutes, fighting the urge to turn around and walk away. Imposter syndrome whispered in his ear, telling him he didn't belong here. That Chen would take one look at him in the daylight and realize he had made a mistake. But Marcus thought about his mother, about the sacrifices she had made to support his musical education when he was young. She had believed in him completely, never doubting his talent even when money was tight. He owed it to her memory to walk through those doors. The receptionist directed him to Chen's office on the 3rd floor. Marcus climbed the stairs slowly, his heart pounding. The hallways were filled with the sound of music, students practicing in various rooms, the scales and arpeggios and pieces blending together into a symphony of dedicated effort. Chen's office door was open. The professor sat behind a desk covered in sheet music and papers, but he looked up immediately when Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Marcus, right on time. Come in. Close the door." Marcus did as instructed, taking the seat Chen indicated across from his desk. The office walls were covered with photographs of Chen with famous musicians, diplomas and awards, shelves full of music books and recordings. "I've been doing some research on you this weekend," Chen said without preamble. "I called the San Francisco Conservatory, spoke to some colleagues there. They remember you very well. Your teachers said you were one of the most naturally gifted students they had ever taught. Your academic record was excellent. They were devastated when you had to leave." Marcus didn't know what to say to this, so he remained silent. "I also watched that video of you that's been going around. 5 million views now, I believe. Quite remarkable." Chen leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus. "I have a proposal for you." "Well, several proposals, actually." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his full attention on Chen. "First, I want to arrange for you to complete your degree. I've already spoken to the administration here at Juilliard. We're prepared to accept your transfer credits from San Francisco and allow you to complete your final semester here. Full scholarship, of course, which would cover tuition and provide a modest living stipend." Marcus felt dizzy hearing the words. It seemed impossible, too good to be true. "I don't understand. Why would Juilliard do this for me?" Chen smiled. "Partially because I convinced them to, but mostly because that video has brought an enormous amount of positive attention to classical music and music education. The story of a trained musician overcoming homelessness and hardship through his art resonates with people. Juilliard, like all institutions, understands the value of positive publicity. Having you complete your education here, having you succeed, it's good for everyone." "What are the other proposals?" Marcus asked, his voice barely steady. "I want you to study with me personally. I don't take many private students anymore, but your playing has qualities that interest me greatly. Your technical skill is already at a professional level, but your interpretation, your emotional expression, that needs refinement. You play like someone who has suffered, which gives your music depth, but you need to learn to channel that suffering into artistry rather than just pouring it out raw." Marcus nodded, understanding what Chen meant. "Third," Chen continued, "I'm going to arrange for you to give a recital. A real one in a proper venue. I have connections with several concert halls in the city. We'll schedule it for late spring, after you've had time to work with me and complete your degree." We'll invite critics, industry professionals, potential managers, and agents. It will be your formal introduction to the professional music world. The scope of what Chen was offering was overwhelming. Marcus felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Professor Chen, I don't know how to thank you. This is more than I could have ever hoped for. Chen held up his hand. Don't thank me yet. This is going to be incredibly hard work. You've been living on the streets for months. You're not in peak physical condition. Getting you back to the level you need to be for a professional debut will require dedication and discipline. You'll be working harder than you've ever worked in your life. I'm ready for that, Marcus said firmly. I've lost everything once. I know what it's like to have nothing. I won't waste this opportunity. Good. Chen pulled out a folder from his desk drawer and slid it across to Marcus. Here's the paperwork for Juilliard. Fill it out and return it to the admissions office by the end of the week. Classes start in January, which gives you about 3 weeks to get settled. I've also included information about student housing. They're going to provide you with a dorm room starting immediately. Marcus took the folder with shaking hands, hardly able to believe what was happening. There's one more thing, Chen said, his expression becoming more serious. That video has made you somewhat famous. People are going to want interviews, appearances, all sorts of attention. You need to be very careful about how you handle this. Fame is fleeting, especially internet fame. What matters is your music and your career. Don't let the attention distract you from the work. I understand, Marcus said. The music is what matters. It's all that's ever mattered. Chen smiled, apparently satisfied with this answer. I'm going to give you some assignments to work on before we start our formal lessons. Pieces I want you to learn. Techniques I want you to practice. Can you read music on a computer or do you need physical scores? I can work with either. Good, I'll email you the assignments tonight. Chen stood up, extending his hand across the desk. Welcome to Juilliard, Marcus. Let's see what we can make of that raw talent of yours. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of adjustment and intense work. Marcus moved into the student housing at Juilliard, a small dorm room that felt like a palace compared to sleeping on cold streets or in crowded shelters. He had a bed, a desk, a place to practice without worrying about police telling him to move along. The simple luxuries of regular meals and hot showers still felt miraculous, but Chen had not been exaggerating about the work. The professor pushed Marcus relentlessly, rebuilding his technique from the ground up. Hours each day were spent on scales, etudes, exercises designed to strengthen muscles that had weakened during months of malnutrition and irregular practice. Chen was demanding but never cruel, always explaining why each exercise mattered, how each technique would serve the music. The media attention continued, though Marcus tried to manage it carefully as Chen had advised. He gave a few interviews to major publications, telling his story but always steering the conversation back to music and the importance of arts education. He declined reality show offers and sensationalist programs, focusing instead on building credibility as a serious musician. Jennifer, the woman who had mocked him that day outside the cafe, became an unlikely ally. She used her social media expertise to help Marcus build a genuine online presence, one that showcased his playing and his journey without exploiting his past homelessness. She worked with him for free, saying it was the least she could do to make amends for her initial cruelty. Sarah, the cafe manager's daughter, became Marcus's first regular student. He taught her twice a week at the cafe, and the sessions quickly became popular events. Other customers would arrive early on lesson nights, ordering coffee and pastries just to listen to Marcus teach. The cafe owner didn't mind. Business had tripled since the viral video, with people coming from across the city hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous street violinist. Marcus began teaching other students as well, carefully selected ones who showed genuine dedication. The income from teaching helped him save money and gave him valuable experience. More importantly, teaching forced him to articulate principles he had absorbed intuitively, deepening his own understanding of music. As winter turned to spring, Marcus's strength returned. Regular food and sleep, combined with Chen's rigorous training program, transformed him physically. The gaunt, desperate look left his face. His playing became stronger, more controlled, infused with the technical precision that Chen demanded without losing the emotional intensity that made it special. Chen introduced Marcus to other faculty members and visiting artists. These connections were invaluable, expanding Marcus's understanding of interpretation and style. He attended master classes, observed rehearsals, and slowly built a network in the professional music world. In March, Chen announced that he had secured a venue for Marcus's recital. It would be held at Merkin Concert Hall in late May, a respected space known for launching careers. The news was both exhilarating and terrifying. This would be Marcus's formal debut, his chance to prove himself not as a viral sensation, but as a serious artist. The program for the recital became the focus of intense work with Chen. They selected pieces that would showcase Marcus's technical abilities while also demonstrating musical maturity and interpretive depth. Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and a contemporary piece by a living composer that Chen thought would resonate with Marcus's personal journey. But as the recital date approached, Marcus began to feel the pressure mounting. The publicity surrounding his story meant that the concert had attracted significant attention. Tickets sold out within hours of going on sale. Music critics from major publications confirmed they would attend. Record label representatives would be there. This single performance could determine the trajectory of his entire career. Marcus started having panic attacks during practice sessions. His hands would shake. His breathing would become irregular and doubt would flood his mind. What if he froze on stage? What if his playing wasn't as good as people expected? What if he was just a street musician who got lucky, not a real artist? Chen noticed the anxiety and adjusted his approach. Instead of more technical work, he started talking to Marcus about the mental aspects of performance, about dealing with pressure and expectation. "You've already faced the hardest audience you'll ever have," Chen told him during one session when Marcus's nerves were particularly bad. "Those people on the street who laughed at you, who thought you were worthless. You played for them when you were starving, exhausted, at your absolute lowest point, and your music transformed them. Everything else after that is easier." The words helped, but the anxiety didn't completely disappear. Marcus dealt with it by practicing more, sometimes playing for 8 or 10 hours a day, working through the program until every note was completely secure. 2 weeks before the recital, something unexpected happened. Marcus received a letter forwarded from the San Francisco Conservatory. It was from his former teacher there, Professor Morrison, who had mentored him during his 3 years at the school. Morrison had seen the video and followed Marcus's story. The letter was warm and encouraging, expressing pride in Marcus's resilience and excitement about his upcoming recital. But it also contained news that made Marcus's throat tighten with emotion. The conservatory had established a scholarship in his mother's name. The fund would provide full tuition and living expenses for music students who had to interrupt their education due to family medical crises. Morrison wrote that Marcus's story had inspired several major donors to contribute, and the scholarship would help students facing the same impossible choices Marcus had faced. Marcus read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. His mother's suffering had been transformed into something that would help others. The senselessness of her death and his subsequent hardships had been given meaning. He carried the letter with him constantly in the days that followed, reading it whenever doubt threatened to overwhelm him. Jennifer helped Marcus create a video response to the scholarship announcement. In it, he spoke about his mother, about her support of his music, about the impossible choice between finishing school and caring for her. The video went viral again, this time sparking conversations about healthcare, education costs, and the support systems that fail vulnerable people. The week before the recital, Chen reduced Marcus's practice schedule. "You're as prepared as you can be," the professor said. "Now you need to rest physically and mentally. Trust in the work you've done." Marcus used the extra time to reach out to people who had helped him. He visited the cafe where he had played that transformative performance, bringing gifts for the manager and his daughter. He met with Jennifer for coffee, thanking her for turning her mistake into something positive. He even visited the shelter where he had sometimes stayed, playing a free concert for the residents and staff. On the evening before the recital, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in his dorm room bed looking at the ceiling, his violin in its case nearby. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from promising student to homeless musician to tomorrow night's performer. So much could have gone differently. If Chen hadn't been walking by that day, if his playing hadn't been good enough to stop people, if he had given up and sold his violin months ago. But he hadn't given up. Even in his darkest moments on the street, he had held on to his violin and his identity as a musician. That determination, that refusal to let go of who he was at his core had saved him. Marcus got out of bed and opened his violin case. The instrument looked the same as always, worn and well-used, bearing the marks of his grandfather's decades of playing and his own years of practice. He lifted it gently, feeling its familiar weight, and carried it to the window. Outside, the city glowed with millions of lights, people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, struggling with their problems. Somewhere out there were people sleeping on streets, invisible to the crowds walking past. Marcus thought about them, about the talents and dreams that homelessness buried, about the potential that poverty destroyed. He raised the violin to his shoulder and played softly, just for himself. Not Vivaldi or Bach or any of the pieces he would perform tomorrow, but a simple melody his mother had loved. The notes floated out into the night, private and personal, a prayer and a promise. Tomorrow he would play for critics and industry professionals, for people who could launch or destroy his career with their reviews. But tonight he played for his mother, for his younger self who had dreamed of stages and audiences, and for the homeless musician he had been just months ago who had believed his playing still mattered, even when the world told him it didn't. The day of the recital arrived bright and warm, an unusually beautiful May evening in New York. Marcus woke early despite having slept little, his body humming with nervous energy. He went through his morning routine carefully, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, even though nothing about today was normal. Chen had arranged for Marcus to have access to a practice room at the concert hall in the afternoon, a chance to familiarize himself with the acoustics and settle his nerves. Marcus arrived at 3 o'clock, 4 hours before the performance was scheduled to begin. The practice room was quiet and empty, offering a refuge from the gathering storm of anticipation. Marcus unpacked his violin, tuned it carefully, and began to play through his program. His fingers moved through the familiar passages, muscle memory guiding him through scales and difficult runs. The sound resonated beautifully in the space, and slowly Marcus felt himself beginning to relax. Chen arrived an hour later, listening from the doorway without announcing himself. When Marcus finished the piece he was working on, the professor entered the room, nodding approvingly. "You sound ready. How do you feel?" Marcus considered the question honestly. "Terrified, excited, like everything in my life has led to this moment." "Good answers, all of them." Chen pulled up a chair. "I want to tell you something. Regardless of what happens tonight, regardless of reviews or opportunities that may or may not follow, you've already succeeded. You survived an experience that destroys many people. You held onto your art when you had nothing else. You fought your way back. That's the real victory. Everything else is just details." The words settled something in Marcus, easing the tightness in his chest. Chen was right. He had already proven what mattered most, at least to himself. "Now," Chen continued, "let's talk about the performance. Remember what I've taught you about connecting with the audience. You're not playing at them. You're sharing something with them. Let them into the music. Let them feel what you feel." They talked for another hour, not about technique or interpretation, but about the emotional core of performance, about what it meant to communicate through music. By the time Chen left to get ready himself, Marcus felt centered and focused. Jennifer arrived backstage an hour before the performance, bringing Marcus a good luck card signed by dozens of people who had followed his story online. The cafe manager and his daughter Sarah came by with flowers. Even the elderly woman who had been the first to applaud that day outside the cafe appeared, pressing a small religious medal into his hand for protection and luck. As 7 o'clock approached and the audience began filling the hall, Marcus stood in the wings, breathing deeply, listening to the murmur of hundreds of voices. He thought about all the people out there, the critics who could make or break careers with their words, the industry professionals who decided which musicians got recording contracts and management deals, the ordinary music lovers who had bought tickets to hear the homeless violinist who had become briefly famous. The house lights dimmed. The stage manager gave Marcus a nod and he walked out onto the stage. The applause that greeted him was warm and generous, but Marcus barely heard it. His focus had narrowed to the instrument in his hands and the music waiting to be released. He bowed briefly to the audience, positioned himself, and lifted his violin. The first piece was the Bach partita in D minor, specifically the famous Chaconne. Marcus had chosen it deliberately, despite Chen's concern about opening with such a demanding work. The chaconne was a mountain that every serious violinist had to climb, a piece so profound and complex that it could reveal everything about a musician's soul and skill. Marcus drew the first notes from his instrument, and immediately the hall fell into absolute silence. His playing was controlled and precise, yet deeply expressive. Each variation of the theme built on the last, creating an architecture of sound that was both intellectual and emotional. He had lived with this piece for months now, working with Chen to understand not just how to play the notes but what they meant. The audience listened, transfixed, as Marcus navigated the technical challenges effortlessly, his fingers flying through the rapid passages, his bow producing tones that ranged from whisper-soft to powerfully resonant. But it was the slow sections that truly captivated, where Marcus's interpretation revealed depths of emotion that left people holding their breath. When the final chord faded into silence, there was a moment of absolute stillness, the kind of pregnant pause that follows truly great performances. Then the applause erupted, long and thunderous. Several people in the audience stood, though the piece was only the first of the evening. Marcus lowered his violin, accepting the response with a small bow, then prepared for the second piece. The rest of the first half passed in a blur of music and concentration. He played a Beethoven sonata with technical brilliance and emotional nuance, bringing out both the revolutionary fire and the tender lyricism in the composer's writing. During intermission, Marcus retreated to his dressing room. He could hear the buzz of conversation from the lobby, the excited tone suggesting the audience was impressed. Chen appeared briefly, simply squeezing Marcus's shoulder without speaking. The gesture said everything that needed saying. The second half of the program began with the Brahms Violin Sonata in G major. This was the piece Marcus had worked on most intensively with Chen, refining every phrase, every dynamic shading. His performance was mature and deeply felt, finding the autumnal beauty in Brahms's late-period writing. For the final piece of the programmed recital, Marcus had chosen a contemporary work commissioned specifically for this performance. Chen had connected him with a young composer named Maria Rodriguez, who had written a piece inspired by Marcus's story. Titled Invisible, the composition incorporated elements of folk melodies and street sounds, transforming them into something achingly beautiful. Marcus poured everything into this piece. The pain of his months on the street, the humiliation of being mocked and dismissed, the joy of being heard and valued, the hope of new beginnings. The music was sometimes dissonant and challenging, but always emotionally truthful. By the end, many people in the audience were openly crying. The applause after the final note was overwhelming, a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Marcus bowed again and again, gesturing to acknowledge the audience's generosity. But he had one more piece to play, an encore he had chosen without telling anyone. When the applause finally began to settle, Marcus lifted his hand for quiet. The audience sat back down, leaning forward with anticipation. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the excellent acoustics. "Before I finish, I want to play one more piece. This is the piece I was playing the day that changed my life, the day many of you saw in that viral video. It's Vivaldi's Winter, and I'd like to dedicate it to everyone who has ever felt invisible, everyone who has been judged by their circumstances rather than their worth." He raised his violin and began to play. The familiar opening bars filled the hall, and for many in the audience it was a moment of powerful recognition. This was the piece they had heard in the video, played by a desperate man outside a cafe. But hearing it now in a concert hall performed by this transformed artist gave it new meaning. Marcus played it differently than he had that day on the street. The technique was more refined now, the interpretation more sophisticated, but the emotional core remained the same. The fierce determination, the refusal to be silenced, the insistence that art mattered even in the darkest circumstances. When he played the final flourish and the last note died away, the silence lasted even longer this time. Then the audience rose as one, applauding with an enthusiasm that bordered on frenzy. People were shouting bravos, whistling, some openly weeping. Marcus stood on the stage, violin in hand, and let himself feel it all. The validation, the acceptance, the recognition that his music had value. He thought about the young man who had stood outside a cafe 6 months ago, hungry and desperate, asking if he could perform for a bite of food. He thought about the laughter that had greeted that request, and the music that had transformed everything. The reviews the next morning exceeded even Chen's optimistic expectations. The New York Times critic wrote that Marcus represented the future of classical music, praising his technical mastery and emotional depth. Other major publications echoed the sentiment, with several critics noting that the performance transcended the viral video story, establishing Marcus as a serious artist in his own right. More importantly, the industry professionals who had attended the concert responded with concrete offers. 3 management companies reached out, competing to represent him. 2 record labels expressed interest in recording contracts. Invitations to perform with regional orchestras began arriving, along with requests for chamber music collaborations and festival appearances. Marcus met with each opportunity carefully, consulting with Chen before making any decisions. The professor guided him through the complex world of contracts and professional relationships, helping him avoid common pitfalls that trapped young musicians. Together, they selected a management company known for developing long-term careers rather than chasing short-term publicity. Within weeks, Marcus's schedule for the next year began filling up. A recording contract was signed with a respected classical label, with plans to record his debut album that summer. Festival appearances were booked for prestigious events in Aspen, Tanglewood, and Europe. Most significantly, he was invited to perform as a soloist with the New York Philharmonic in their fall season, a remarkable opportunity for someone so early in their professional career. But Marcus was careful not to lose sight of what had brought him to this point. He continued teaching his students, including Sarah, who had progressed remarkably under his guidance. The cafe lessons became a regular part of his routine, a connection to the community that had witnessed his transformation. He also began a new project inspired by the scholarship established in his mother's name. Working with Jennifer's social media expertise and Chen's connections, Marcus organized a series of free concerts in shelters and community centers across New York. He called the series Invisible Voices, and it featured both his own performances and showcases for talented, homeless musicians he had met during his time on the streets. One of these musicians, a jazz pianist named Terrence who had been living in the same shelter where Marcus had sometimes stayed, became a particular focus. Marcus used his new platform to draw attention to Terrence's extraordinary talent, eventually helping him secure a regular gig at a respected jazz club. Other success stories followed, as Marcus worked to create pathways for homeless artists to rebuild their careers. The media loved these stories of Marcus using his success to help others, but he was careful to keep the focus on the artists themselves rather than on his role as benefactor. He understood from personal experience how humiliating it felt to be defined by your circumstances rather than your abilities. In August, Marcus recorded his debut album. The repertoire mixed classical masterworks with contemporary compositions, including an expanded version of Rodriguez's Invisible that had premiered at his recital. The recording sessions were intense but rewarding, capturing performances that Chen declared among the finest Marcus had produced. When the album was released in October, it received critical acclaim and unexpected commercial success. Classical albums rarely made significant impacts on mainstream charts, but Marcus's story and the quality of the playing attracted attention beyond the usual classical music audience. The album charted in the top 20 on Billboard's main album chart, an almost unheard-of achievement for a classical recording. The performance with the New York Philharmonic in November was the crowning moment of Marcus's first year as a professional musician. He performed the Brahms Violin Concerto, one of the most demanding works in the repertoire, with maturity and artistry that silenced any remaining skeptics who thought he was merely a viral sensation. Standing on the stage of David Geffen Hall, with a world-class orchestra behind him and thousands of people in the audience, Marcus felt the full weight of how far he had come. Just 1 year ago, he had been sleeping on streets invisible to the crowds rushing past. Now he stood at the pinnacle of his profession, playing music that moved hearts and minds. But success brought its own challenges. The demands on his time were relentless, with constant travel, performances, interviews, and obligations. Marcus found himself exhausted, struggling to maintain the practice schedule that kept his playing at the highest level. The pressure to follow up his successful debut with equally impressive performances created a different kind of stress than he had experienced before. In December, Marcus returned to Juilliard to give a master class for current students. Standing in front of young musicians who looked at him with admiration and perhaps envy, Marcus spoke honestly about his journey. People see the success now and think it must be wonderful, and it is, don't misunderstand me. But it's also incredibly hard work and constant pressure. The difference between now and when I was on the street isn't that the challenges disappeared. It's that I have resources to face them, support systems, opportunities to solve problems. He talked about the importance of mental health, about managing expectations, about maintaining perspective when success came. Your worth as a human being isn't determined by your musical success or failure. I learned that the hard way. When I lost everything, when I was truly at rock bottom, the music remained. It was mine, regardless of whether anyone heard it or valued it. Remember that. The external validation is wonderful, but the art itself has to be enough. The students listened intently, and several approached him afterward with their own stories of struggle and doubt. Marcus gave each person his full attention, offering advice and encouragement, remembering how desperately he had needed someone to believe in him when he had nothing. As the year ended, Marcus took time to reflect on everything that had happened since that December day when he had asked if he could perform for a bite of food. He thought about the laughter that had met his request, about how close he had come to walking away without playing at all. One different decision, one moment of giving in to despair, and none of this would have happened. He visited the cafe where it had all begun, sitting at one of the outdoor tables on a cold afternoon similar to that fateful day. The manager brought him coffee and a pastry, refusing payment as always. They chatted about Sarah, who was thriving in her studies and crediting Marcus's teaching with her improvement. "You know what I think about most?" Marcus said, looking at the sidewalk where he had stood with his violin case open. "All the other talented people out there who never get their moment. How many amazing musicians are on the streets right now, invisible to everyone walking past? How many writers, artists, scientists, people with gifts that the world will never see, because circumstances destroyed their opportunities?" The manager nodded thoughtfully. "You can't save everyone, but you can try to help where you can." "That's what I'm trying to do," Marcus agreed. "The Invisible Voices concerts, the advocacy work, helping individual artists when I can. It's not enough, but it's something." Marcus completed his degree from Juilliard in January, walking across the stage to receive his diploma with his grandfather's violin in his hands. Chen was there, beaming with pride, along with Jennifer, Sarah, the cafe manager, and dozens of others who had supported his journey. Looking out at their faces, Marcus understood that success wasn't a solo performance but a symphony, with countless people contributing their part to create something beautiful. His career continued to flourish in the months that followed. He performed across America and Europe, building a reputation as one of the most compelling violinists of his generation. Critics praised not just his technical abilities but his interpretive depth, the way his playing seemed to speak directly to the heart of human experience. But Marcus never forgot where he had come from. He kept the clothes he had worn when he was homeless, the threadbare jacket and worn shoes stored carefully in his closet. Occasionally, when success felt overwhelming or when he found himself getting lost in the trappings of professional classical music, he would take them out and remember. He remembered the cold, the hunger, the humiliation of being dismissed as worthless. He remembered the laughter of people who looked at his circumstances and never bothered to wonder about his story or his abilities. And he remembered the music, always the music, the one thing that remained constant through all the changes and challenges. On the anniversary of his viral performance, Marcus returned to the same spot outside the cafe. This time, he didn't ask permission or apologize for his presence. He simply opened his violin case, took out his instrument, and began to play. A crowd gathered quickly, drawn by the music and by recognition of who he was. But Marcus played as if he were still invisible, as if no one could see him and the music was for himself alone. He played for his mother, whose love had first given him music. He played for his younger self, full of dreams and ambition. He played for Terrence and the other homeless musicians whose talents deserved recognition. He played for everyone who had ever felt unseen, unvalued, dismissed by a world too busy to notice their worth. When he finished and the applause came, Marcus smiled and bowed. But what he treasured most was the moment before the first note, standing with his violin raised, remembering what it felt like to ask if he could perform for a bite of food and being met with laughter. That memory kept him humble, kept him connected to the reality that talent and worth existed everywhere, in every corner of society, waiting to be recognized. The violin case at his feet was empty this time. He didn't need the money anymore. But as people pressed forward to thank him, to shake his hand, to tell him how his music had moved them, Marcus thought about that day when his case had overflowed with bills and coins, when strangers had competed to help after hearing him play. People hadn't changed that day. Marcus hadn't become more talented between the moment they mocked him and the moment they applauded. What had changed was that they had stopped to listen, had given him the chance to be heard. That was the lesson Marcus carried with him, the truth he tried to share through his advocacy work and his music. Everyone deserved to be heard. Everyone had value, and sometimes the difference between invisibility and recognition was simply someone willing to stop, to pay attention, to really listen. Marcus closed his violin case and walked away from the cafe, disappearing into the flow of pedestrians on the Manhattan sidewalk. He had another performance that evening, another audience waiting to hear him play. But he would return to this spot again, would keep coming back to remember, to honor the journey that had brought him from desperation to success. The music continued as it always had, as it always would. And somewhere in the city, on some cold street corner, another talented musician waited for someone to stop and listen, to see past the circumstances to the artist beneath. Marcus knew he couldn't save them all, couldn't give everyone the opportunity that Robert Chen had given him, but he could keep trying, keep using his platform to draw attention to invisible voices, keep remembering that he had once been exactly where they were. That memory, more than any award or accolade, more than any critical praise or professional triumph, was what made him grateful. Grateful for the music that had saved him, grateful for the people who had helped him, and grateful for the second chance that so few people in his position ever received. He would spend the rest of his career trying to ensure that others got their chance too. That talent and dedication were recognized regardless of circumstances, that no one ever had to ask if they could perform for a bite of food and be met with laughter instead of opportunity.